Taxation. Governments use indirect taxes to affect the supply of some goods and services. Indirect taxes can be imposed on the purchase of goods or services. There are two types of indirect tax: specific taxes and ad valorem taxes. Specific taxes, these are a tax that are at a fixed amount that changes per unit of a particular good. Okay, so the fixed amount that's charged on a per unit of good and it does not change. For example, a set amount of tax can be put on bottles of water regardless of their price. So if the bottle of water is £1, the same tax, say 20p, would be levied on a bottle that would say 30p. So the £1 bottle costs £1.20, the 30p bottle will now cost 50p. On the other hand, ad valorem taxes, ad valorem means add value, these are charged as a proportion of the price of a good. For example, a 20% tax on the price of a good would mean that a £10 product, it's £2 for the tax, and a £100 product, it's £20. Indirect taxes increase costs for producers, so this causes the supply curve to shift to the left. So I'm going to show you that now on two diagrams. A specific tax causes a parallel shift of the supply curve. The tax is the same fixed amount at a low price and a high price. So for instance, we say 30p bottle of water with the tax of 20p. The tax is 20p here as well. For the pound bottle, it now costs 50p. If the pound bottle we're talking about, with the tax on top, would become not £120, that would be extremely expensive, £1.20. Okay, so we now have an ad valorem tax. An ad valorem tax causes a non-parallel shift of the supply curve, with the biggest impact being on the higher priced goods. The tax is a small amount at a low price compared to a higher price. So if we say about a £10 good here, look, there's our £10. We add £2 on top, and that will get us to £12. In contrast, if we're talking about a £100 item, we add 20% on top, so in other words £20, this distance here, and we can see that the good is £120 after the tax has been added. All of this at 20% tax rate. Okay. Governments tax goods with negative externalities. Governments often put extra indirect tax on goods that have negative externalities such as petrol, alcohol and tobacco. Governments may use multiple indirect taxes on one item. For example, in the UK, cigarettes have a specific tax called excise duty and an ad valorem tax on their retail price. The aim of this taxation is to internalise the externality that the good produces. For example, make the producer and or the consumer of the product cover the costs of its externalities. The taxes make revenue for the government, which can be used to offset the effects of the externalities. For example, the revenue generated from a tax on alcohol could be used to pay for the additional police time needed to deal with alcohol-related crime. Another example of a specific tax used in the UK is landfill tax. The tax aims to reduce the impacts of environmental market failure linked to landfill. Local authorities or firms that dispose of waste at landfill sites are charged an environmental tax. The tax is set an amount which attempts to reflect the full social costs of using landfill. For instance, external costs linked to the burying of waste in landfill, such as pollution released from landfill sites. The tax should encourage recycling, which in turn will reduce the negative externalities caused by landfill that harm the environment. However, the tax has led to an increase in fly tipping by firms to avoid having to pay the tax. Fly tipping being the illegal dumping of waste on land that isn't designated for waste disposal, for example, farmland and roadsides. The total amount of tax paid can be shown on a diagram. The diagram shows the effect of an ad valorem tax. Now we know it's an ad valorem tax because of the distance here is greater than the distance here. In other words, when supply shifted to the left, it wasn't a parallel shift. So supply is shifted to S1. In the diagram, the total tax paid is this area. So the total tax is P1 CAP2. Now the price that the consumer pays in the shop is now going to be after the tax P1. Before they were paying P. So they're paying slightly more. So in terms of who is paying the tax, the consumer is paying the larger proportion of the tax. They are paying the purple area, P1 CBP. The remainder of the tax burden falls on the producer, which will be area P, B, A and P2. So the amount of tax passed on to the consumer will depend on the price elasticity of demand. If demand for a good is price inelastic, most of it or all the extra cost is likely to be passed on to the consumer. If demand for a good is price elastic, then the producer is much more likely to take on most of the cost. So, if you imagine that the demand curve, in fact I'll draw another diagram.
As long as it's not to me, I don't mind.
Okay, so we can see on both diagrams that the yellow area represents the total tax. In orange, we can see the amount that the consumer pays of that tax. You can see that the vast majority of the tax when demand inelastic is paid by the consumer, while when it's elastic, a small amount is paid by the consumer. Yet, when the demand is elastic, the producer pays the larger chunk of it. This makes sense because if the consumer paid any more for the product, they would switch to a different good. There are advantages and disadvantages of tax. The cost of the negative externalities is internalised in the price of the good. This may reduce demand for the good and the level of its production, reducing the effects of the negative externality. If demand isn't reduced, there's still the benefit that the revenue gained from the tax can be used by the government to offset the externalities. For example, tax on cigarettes could be used for funding government services to help people to stop smoking. Disadvantages. It can be difficult to put a monetary value on the cost of the negative externalities. For goods where demand is price inelastic, as we've just shown, the demand isn't reduced by the extra cost of the tax, although lots of tax revenue is collected that could be spent on discouraging people from consuming the demerit good. Indirect taxes usually increase the cost of production, which reduces a product's international competitiveness. Firms may choose to relocate and sell their goods abroad to avoid the indirect taxation. This would remove their contributions to the economy, such as the payment of tax and provision of employment. Finally, the money raised by taxes on demerit goods might not be spent on reducing the effects of the externalities.